The day I lost my job, I kept quiet about my secret assets, the company I owned, or that huge mansion in my name. Parents called me a failure. Husband walked out on me. You won't believe what happened next. What's the most valuable thing you own? For me, it isn't this house, or the multi-million-dollar company I built in secret. It was the illusion that I was ordinary, an illusion so perfect that when I got fired, my husband left me and my family disowned me for being a failure. They took everything they thought I had. Now, I'm about to show them everything I actually do. Question is, should I be merciful?
Hey, store lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go.
It all began in a sterile, gray cubicle under the flickering fluorescent lights of Viridian Corp. The building itself was a monument to corporate mediocrity. Beige walls, standard-issue furniture, and the persistent smell of burnt coffee and broken dreams. I had worked here for 6 years, playing the role of Jennifer Smith, the mid-level marketing analyst who kept her head down and did her job adequately but never exceptionally. My boss, a man named Edward Clark whose smile never quite reached his eyes, slid a pink slip across my desk. His manicured fingers drummed impatiently on the particle board surface as he delivered his rehearsed speech. "I'm sorry, Jennifer," he said, the words as hollow as a drum. "We're downsizing. It's not personal. Budget constraints, you understand. The board has made some difficult decisions." But it felt personal. It felt like the final brick being pulled from a wall that was already crumbling. I had watched him hire his nephew, Marcus Clark, just 3 weeks prior, a fresh-faced business school graduate with no experience but the right last name. The mathematics of corporate nepotism were simple and brutal. "I understand," I replied, my voice steady despite the theater of the moment. "How long do I have?" "Security will escort you out in 20 minutes," he said, already turning his attention back to his computer screen. "HR will handle the paperwork. Your final paycheck will be direct deposited as usual. 20 minutes to pack up 6 years of carefully constructed mediocrity." I opened my desk drawers methodically, placing the pathetic contents into a small cardboard box. A chipped coffee mug with "World's Okayest Employee" printed on the side. A gag gift from the last office Christmas party. A framed photo of a smiling couple that no longer existed, and a wilted succulent that I had somehow managed to keep barely alive despite the office's hostile environment. As I walked the green mile past my colleagues, their averted eyes and pitying glances felt like tiny daggers. They saw a woman whose life had just been torpedoed, a mid-level marketing analyst, made redundant. Sarah from accounting whispered something to Tom from IT, both of them stealing glances at me with that particular mixture of sympathy and relief that comes from witnessing someone else's misfortune. They had no idea. They couldn't possibly know that the woman they pitied held the fate of their entire company in the palm of her hand. But that secret was my armor, and I wore it like a second skin. The security guard, a kind man named Rodriguez who had always greeted me warmly, walked beside me with obvious discomfort. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Smith," he said quietly as we reached the elevator. "It's not right what they're doing." "Thank you, Rodriguez," I said, genuinely touched by his kindness. "Take care of yourself." Elevator descended slowly, each floor bringing me closer to my liberation, though neither Rodriguez nor I knew it at the time. The lobby was bustling with the usual afternoon chaos. Delivery people, visitors, employees returning from lunch. I walked through it all invisible now, just another casualty of corporate efficiency. The drive home was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and traffic lights bleeding into one another. Seattle's weather seemed to mirror the day's events, gray, relentless, and unforgiving. I navigated the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the identical suburban houses with their manicured lawns and 2-car garages. Each house told the story of middle-class contentment, of lives lived within acceptable parameters. I didn't cry. The time for tears was long past. I was in a state of hyperclarity, a cold, calm certainty settling in my bones. The universe wasn't punishing me. It was giving me an opening. The final thread holding me to this manufactured life had just been severed. I pulled into the driveway of 1247 Maple Street, the modest suburban house I shared with my husband, David Jones. The house he so often reminded me was mostly paid for by his superior salary as a regional sales manager at Northwestern Chemical Solutions. It was a 3-bedroom colonial with vinyl siding and a small front porch that I had once thought charming, but now saw for what it was, a stage set for a play I had never auditioned for. I walked through the front door, expecting the usual silence of an empty house. Instead, I found chaos. David was in the living room, surrounded by open suitcases. His clothes were folded with military precision, a habit from his brief stint in the National Guard that he never let anyone forget. His golf clubs were already packed and waiting by the door. He didn't even look up when I came in. "Bother unpacking your box," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I'm leaving." I placed the box on the floor with a soft thud, studying his profile. At 42, David still carried himself with the confidence of the high school quarterback he had once been. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant he had already made his decision and was simply going through the motions of announcing it. "Just like that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He finally looked at me, and his expression was one of profound, weary disappointment. It was the same look he had given me when I suggested we take that cooking class together, or when I had mentioned wanting to go back to school for my MBA. It was the look of a man who had settled for less than he believed he deserved. "I can't do this anymore, Jennifer. I need a partner, not a project. You lost your job. We both know you have no ambition, no drive. I'm tying myself to a sinking ship." He picked up his wedding ring from the coffee table, a simple gold band that had cost 2 months of his salary 7 years ago, and tossed it onto the carpet. It landed on the rug with a dull, pathetic sound. "I'm going to stay with Kimberly." At least she has a future. Kimberly Brown, the ambitious junior associate from his firm, 28 years old, blonde, and hungry for success in the way that David found intoxicating. I had met her at the company Christmas party, had watched her laugh at his jokes and hang on his every word about regional sales strategies. Of course. The pieces clicked into place not with a bang, but with a quiet, resigned sigh. "Long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Does it matter?" he replied, but something in his posture suggested it had been going on for months. "Look, Jennifer, we can handle this like adults. I'll file the paperwork. You can keep the house until it sells, but I'll need my half of everything. The savings, the investments, all of it. I've got a lawyer who says—" "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice even. It was a simple statement of fact, not a plea. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that I had never heard from him before. "Yeah, right. Good luck, Jennifer. You're going to need it." He zipped up the last suitcase with violent efficiency, grabbed his coat from the closet, and walked to the door. He paused for just a moment, his hand on the doorknob, and I thought he might say something else. Instead, he shook his head and walked out. He didn't look back. The click of the lock echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the house. I stood there for a full minute, listening to the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. The engine noise faded into the distance, taking with it the last remnants of Jennifer the wife, Jennifer the dependent, Jennifer the disappointment. The sinking ship was gone. The captain, however, remained. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, vibrating insistently like an angry wasp. The caller ID showed Mom, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But Mary Nelson had a way of making her disapproval known, and avoiding her would only make the eventual conversation worse. Her timing, as always, was impeccable. I answered on the 4th ring. "Jennifer, your father and I just heard from David," she began, no preamble, no "how are you holding up" or "are you okay?" Her voice was sharp with disapproval, carrying the particular tone she had perfected over 63 years of life, the voice of a woman who had never met a situation she couldn't judge. "He told us what happened. You lost your job. Honestly, I don't know why we're surprised. We told you that marketing nonsense was a dead end. You should have listened to us from the beginning." I walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I had pretended to belong for so many years. Mrs. Patterson next door was walking her small dog, the same route she had taken every evening for the past decade. Routine, predictability, the hallmarks of a life lived safely within acceptable boundaries. "Hello, Mom," I said, not bothering to inject any warmth into my voice. "Hello, Mom, me," she continued, working herself up to full indignation. "We told you to get a government job like your father, stable, benefits, a pension you can count on. But no, you had to chase after some fantasy about being creative, being special. Well, look where that got you. My father, George Nelson, grumbled in the background. At 66, he was a retired postal worker who had spent 38 years sorting mail and following other people's rules. His idea of risk-taking was buying the generic brand of breakfast cereal. Should have listened to me, he muttered loud enough for me to hear. Government job, that's security, that's smart planning. What are you going to do now? My mother pressed, her voice rising with each word. You have no job, no husband. David was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you drove him away with your lack of ambition. You have nothing. Nothing. I looked around the beige living room, at the furniture David had picked out, the art my mother had gifted us. Bland landscapes and motivational prints with sayings like live, laugh, love, and home is where the heart is. She was right. In this world, the one they all saw and believed in, I had absolutely nothing. A ghost in a life that was never truly mine. Figure it out, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Figure it out, she scoffed, and I could picture her sitting in her recliner, the one with the worn armrests and the permanent indentation where she had spent countless hours watching daytime television and judging the world. You're 35 years old, Jennifer. Most women your age have established careers, stable marriages, maybe even children. What do you have? What do you have to show for your life? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire I had been trying to extinguish for years. What did I have to show for my life? If only she knew. If only any of them knew. A failure, she continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her disappointment. That's what you are, a failure. Your sister Susan has 3 children and a husband who loves her. Your cousin Patricia just got promoted to department head at the bank. Even your high school friend Michelle owns her own business now. What do you have? I have to go, Mom, I said quietly. You hang up on me, young lady. We're not finished, but we were. I ended the call and set the phone on the counter, watching the screen fade to black. The silence returned, deeper this time. It was the silence of rock bottom, or so they thought. I slowly walked to the window and watched the rain wash the world clean. They had all walked away, convinced they had won, convinced they had accurately assessed my worth and found it wanting. David with his suitcases and his younger woman. My parents with their disappointment and their certainty that they had raised a daughter destined for mediocrity. They couldn't set the perfect trap if they knew I was a player. And the game was just beginning. I didn't reach for a tissue. I didn't pour myself a glass of wine or collapse onto the couch in defeated exhaustion. Instead, I walked upstairs to the master bedroom, to the walk-in closet that David had always complained was too small for both of our wardrobes. Behind my collection of conservative work clothes, the beige blazers and sensible shoes that comprised the uniform of Jennifer, the marketing analyst, was a small, hidden panel in the wall. Inside that panel was my real lifeline. It was a sleek, encrypted device that never saw the light of day inside this house. The phone itself was worth more than most people's monthly salary, military-grade encryption, satellite connectivity untraceable. It was my connection to the world that none of them knew existed, the world where I wasn't Jennifer Smith the failure, but something else entirely. I scrolled to a single contact, a name that would mean nothing to anyone in my old life. Anthony Wilson. Anthony was 34 years old, a former Wall Street prodigy who had been blacklisted from the major firms for his aggressive tactics, but whose talent for financial warfare was unmatched. I had recruited him 2 years ago, offering him something the traditional financial world never could. Complete autonomy and unlimited resources. I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring. Ma'am, his voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of pity. He knew nothing of Jennifer the failed wife or Jennifer the fired analyst. To Anthony Wilson, I was simply his boss, the architect of our enterprise, the shadow queen of a financial empire that operated in the spaces between legitimate business and corporate espionage. Anthony, I said, my voice changing as I shed the skin of the meek woman they all knew. It became sharper, colder, imbued with an authority they would never recognize. The transformation was immediate and complete, like putting on armor that had been custom-made for my true self. Execute protocol, Scythe. Effective immediately. There was a half-second of silence on the other end. Protocol Scythe was our most aggressive contingency plan, a corporate blitzkrieg we had designed for hostile takeovers and financial warfare. It was a scorched earth strategy that we had hoped never to deploy. The plan was comprehensive, ruthless, and devastating, designed to systematically dismantle the financial stability of targeted individuals while remaining completely legal and untraceable. "Of it?" he asked, and I could hear the hint of surprise in his voice. Anthony had worked with me long enough to know that I never acted rashly, never let emotion drive business decisions. This would be the first time we had used protocol scythe for personal matters. "All of it," I confirmed, my voice carrying the cold certainty of a general ordering a strategic strike. "And Anthony, by Viridian Corp." This time the silence was longer. When Anthony spoke again, I could hear the subtle shift in his tone, from surprise to calculation to excitement. "Ma'am, with respect, they're a $500 million company. We'd have to leverage heavily, use multiple shell corporations, coordinate a complex proxy battle. It would take significant resources and, I am aware of the financials." I cut him off, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Their stock took a hit last quarter after they lost the Apex account. They're vulnerable. Market cap is down 18% and their debt-to-equity ratio is deteriorating. I want it. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen." I paused, looking out the bedroom window at the suburban street where I had played my role for so many years. "And Anthony." "Begin phase 2 on the Nelson property portfolio. Full acquisition, immediate implementation." "Understood," he said, and now I could hear it clearly, the thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of a master predator given license to destroy. "Consider it done." I ended the call and carefully returned the phone to its hiding place. The illusion was shattered. The ordinary woman was gone. In her place stood the owner of Ethel Analytics, a secretive but ruthlessly efficient data intelligence and financial services firm that Viridian Corp had been trying, and failing, to identify as a competitor for the past 18 months. The irony was exquisite. They had just fired the founder and CEO of their biggest rival from their own marketing department. The woman they had dismissed as dead weight had been systematically stealing their clients, analyzing their weaknesses, and preparing for their destruction, all from a cubicle on the 3rd floor. An hour later, I was no longer in the stuffy suburban house that had served as my prison for 7 years. I had left it all behind. The cheap furniture, the bad memories, the ghost of a life I'd pretended to live. I took nothing but my box of desk trinkets, which I dumped unceremoniously into a gas station trash can on the outskirts of the city. Watching those pathetic artifacts of my false life tumble into the garbage was surprisingly liberating. My car, not the modest sedan that Jennifer Smith drove to work each day, but a black Aston Martin DB11 that I kept in a private garage across town, ate up the miles with predatory efficiency. The city lights grew smaller in my rearview mirror as I headed north into the mountains, leaving behind the world of mortgage payments and homeowners association meetings. I turned onto a private, unmarked road, the path shielded by a thick canopy of ancient oak trees that had been here long before the city sprawled into the valley below. The road wound upward for nearly 2 miles, climbing into the hills where the air was cleaner and the silence more profound. A set of imposing wrought iron gates stood before me, 10 feet tall and virtually invisible from the main road. They were camouflaged against the woods, hidden by ivy and careful landscaping. I pressed a button on my console. The gates swung open silently, triggered by an encrypted signal that only 3 people on Earth possessed. Motion sensors tracked my approach, and security cameras recorded every angle, their feeds monitored by a team in a facility 1,000 miles away. The driveway wound for another half-mile before the house came into view. It wasn't a house, it was an estate. A sprawling mansion of dark stone and vast panes of glass, a masterpiece of modern architecture that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside itself. The structure was built into the natural contours of the land, with multiple levels cascading down the slope and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the valley below. It was a fortress of solitude and power, my real home. The place where I had spent my true life while playing a role in the world below. I'd bought it 2 years ago, through a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts, paying in cash through a transaction so complex that even the most determined investigator would never trace it back to me. The purchase price was $12 million, pocket change for Ethel Analytics, but more money than Jennifer Smith was supposed to see in a lifetime. This was the headquarters of my real life, the command center from which I had built my empire. It was where I had worked screen by screen, line of code by line of code, late into the night while David snored in the bed beside me, oblivious to the revolution happening just inches away. He thought I was playing games on my laptop, wasting time on social media or online shopping. In a way, I was playing games. Very, very high-stakes games. The main level of the house contained the public spaces, a grand foyer with a floating staircase, a formal dining room that had never hosted a dinner party, and a living area with furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But the real heart of the estate was below, in the levels that descended into the mountain itself. I walked through the grand, echoing foyer, my footsteps the only sound breaking the profound silence. The interior was minimalist and functional, more of a command center than a home. Floor to ceiling, windows overlooked a valley that was entirely my own, 2,000 acres of protected wilderness that served as both privacy shield and buffer zone. I took the private elevator down 3 levels, past the wine cellar and the server farm, to what I privately called the war room. The space was dominated by a bank of monitors, currently displaying a cascade of financial data and market analytics from exchanges around the world. Tokyo, London, New York, the sun never set on the flow of information that fed into my private intelligence network. Anthony had already started. The first tendrils of protocol scythe were reaching out, silently and invisibly, into the financial world. I watched the screens as automated trading algorithms began their work, executing thousands of microtransactions designed to manipulate market conditions in our favor. Short positions were established, credit default swaps were purchased, and friendly investors were quietly alerted to opportunities. A small, secure transaction alert popped up on the main screen. The joint savings account I held with David, containing a little over $47,000. His rainy day, fund that he had been so proud of building, had just been closed. Its contents were transferred to a new account in my name only, then funneled through 3 different corporate accounts belonging to Ethel before disappearing completely into our operational fund. Another alert. David's supplementary credit cards, all tied to my primary accounts, a fact he'd conveniently forgotten when he was lecturing me about financial responsibility, were now being systematically declined. The system would show insufficient funds, but the truth was simpler. I had simply removed his access. I poured myself a glass of water from the small kitchen adjacent to the control room, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire building in my gut. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. For years, he had controlled the narrative, the finances, my sense of self-worth. He had made me feel small, dependent, grateful for whatever scraps of affection he was willing to provide. Tonight, the board had changed. The pieces were mine to move, and I was just getting started. A small smile touched my lips as I watched another alert scroll across the screen. A credit check inquiry from David's name had just been automatically flagged and declined by the 3 major bureaus. He thought I was dead weight, an anchor dragging him down. He was about to find out that I was actually the engine that had been propelling him forward all along. The first call came at 7:00 a.m. the next morning. I was in the gym on the 2nd level of the house, running on a treadmill while monitoring the overnight market activity from Asia. The call display showed David's number, and I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 7:03. Again at 7:07. By 7:15, he had left 4 increasingly frantic messages. On the 5th attempt, I decided to answer, putting the call on speaker while I continued my workout. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice raw with panic and humiliation. "The cards, the bank account, it's all gone. The hotel just declined my card in front of Kimberly and half the Northwestern Chemical sales team. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" I slowed the treadmill to a walking pace, feigning a bored tone. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, David. You said you were leaving. I assumed you had your own arrangements. Our joint account, our savings, you stole it." The desperation in his voice was palpable, and I could picture him packing in whatever cheap hotel room he had been forced to relocate to after the credit card incident. "Actually," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, "if you check the bank records, you'll find that 92% of the deposits into that account for the last 5 years came from my salary. The other 8% barely covered your golf club membership and your monthly car payment." I simply consolidated my assets. You wanted to sever ties, I'm helping you do that. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. He was floundering, completely out of his depth, like a man who had just discovered he had been swimming in the shallow end while believing he was in the ocean. He had never seen this side of me. No one had. This is illegal. I'll sue you. I'll take you for everything you have, he roared, his voice cracking with impotent rage. I almost laughed. The irony was too perfect. Everything I have. David, please. You left with your suitcases and your certainty that I was worthless. According to your own logic, you abandoned a sinking ship. What exactly is there to take? I could hear his ragged breathing, the gears in his mind grinding as he tried to comprehend the shift in power dynamics. The confident man who had walked out 24 hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that the game had rules he had never learned. Have a good day, David. I have work to do. I hung up before he could respond and increased the treadmill's speed back to a full run. The puppet had discovered his strings had been cut. Now it was time to deal with the other puppet masters. My parents lived in a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in Cedar Grove Towers, a well-maintained building in Bellevue's most desirable neighborhood for retirees. They'd lived there for 20 years, enjoying a subsidized rent that was locked in at 1980s rates, thanks to a long-term relationship with the original owner, an elderly Italian immigrant named Sal Marconi, who had treated his tenants like family. What they didn't know was that Sal had died 6 months ago. His children, eager to cash out of the Seattle real estate market and move to Florida, had quietly put the building up for sale. What they also didn't know was that a small, independent property management firm called Cascade Holdings, which I owned through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts, had finalized the purchase of that exact building just 4 weeks ago. The transaction had been handled with the kind of discretion that money could buy. Off-market sale, cash offer, no public records, no newspaper announcements. As far as my parents knew, they were still tenants of the Marconi family, protected by their decades-old lease agreement and their relationship with a man who had been dead for half a year. From my war room, I watched as Anthony's team implemented the next phase of the operation. They had drafted the letters with surgical precision, standard, legally airtight notices sent to all 37 tenants in the building. The building was under new management. Due to rising market rates, increased property taxes, and necessary capital improvements, rent would be increasing by 150% at the end of the next 60-day period. It was a perfectly legal, completely ruthless business decision that happened in Seattle's real estate market dozens of times each year. Older buildings got bought out, rents got raised to market rates, and longtime residents got displaced by the economics of urban development. To my parents, it would be a financial catastrophe that would force them to choose between poverty and homelessness. The beauty of the strategy was its simplicity. I wasn't targeting them specifically. I was treating them exactly like any other tenant in a property I had legitimately acquired. They would have no grounds for complaint, no legal recourse, no one to blame except the anonymous forces of market capitalism. The email notification pinged on my computer at 3:47 p.m. The certified letters had been delivered. All 37 tenants had received their notices simultaneously, creating a building-wide crisis that would mask any personal vendetta. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it. It didn't take long. The phone rang at 5:23 p.m. I was in my study, reviewing the preliminary reports on the Viridian acquisition. Anthony's team had been working around the clock, and the initial phase was proceeding ahead of schedule. Viridian's board was completely unaware that they were under attack. They thought their recent stock volatility was just market turbulence in the wake of losing the Apex account. The caller ID showed Mom, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But I was curious to hear the panic in her voice, to witness the moment when her comfortable certainty about the world began to crumble. "Jennifer, you won't believe what's happened," she began before I could even say hello. Her voice was hysterical, higher pitched than I had ever heard it, with the breathless quality of someone who had just received devastating news. "This new company, some soulless corporation, they bought our building. They're tripling our rent, tripling it. Your father is having chest pains." I let her vent, listening to the panic and indignation pour through the phone like water through a broken dam. She painted a picture of two elderly, innocent victims being preyed upon by a faceless corporate monster, never imagining that the monster had a very familiar face. "That's terrible, Mom," I said, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. "How could they do something like that? They're calling it market rate adjustments and capital improvement necessities," she said, reading directly from the letter. "They want $4,000 a month. $4,000. We've been paying $1,200 for 20 years. It's highway robbery." I could hear my father in the background, his voice more agitated than I had heard since my grandfather's funeral. 38 years I worked for the Postal Service," he was saying. 38 years, this is what we get. This is our reward for being responsible, for saving our money, for playing by the rules. "It's corporate greed, pure and simple," my mother continued. "These investment companies, they buy up affordable housing and price out seniors who built this community. It's predatory. It should be illegal." The irony was exquisite. For 35 years, they had lectured me about the virtues of capitalism, about how success was a matter of hard work and smart decisions. They had praised David's business sense and dismissed my marketing career as frivolous. Now they were discovering that the free market they had always championed didn't care about their feelings or their history or their need for affordable housing. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We don't know," she said, and for the first time in my memory, my mother sounded genuinely frightened. "The letter says we have 60 days to decide, pay the new rent or move out. But where can we go? Rent is crazy expensive everywhere now, and your father's health, moving at our age." She trailed off, the full scope of their crisis finally settling in. They weren't just facing a rent increase. They were facing the destruction of their carefully planned retirement, the end of their financial security, and the very real possibility of homelessness in their 70s. "You have to do something," she said suddenly, her fear transforming into desperate demand. "You have to call a lawyer for us. David always helped us with these things, but now, you have to help us fight this." And there it was. Even now, after calling me their greatest disappointment, after hanging up on me in disgust just 24 hours earlier, they believed it was my duty to solve their problems. They saw me as a tool, a resource to be deployed when needed, someone whose value was measured entirely by my usefulness to them. "I don't know, Mom," I said, planting the seed of doubt. "I just lost my job, remember? I don't have money for lawyers, and David is gone. I have nothing, just like you said." "Be so selfish." She snapped, her fear turning to anger with remarkable speed. "This is your family. We raised you, we sacrificed for you, and now we need help. What are we supposed to do? Become homeless?" The raw desperation in her voice was music to me. This was the consequence of a lifetime of their conditional love, their constant judgment, their willingness to abandon me the moment I failed to meet their expectations. They thought they had broken me with their disappointment. They were about to find out they had actually armed me. "Me see what I can find out," I said softly, injecting just enough hope into my voice to keep them hanging on. "I'll make some calls." I hung up and returned to my monitors, watching the global markets shift and flow like digital rivers of opportunity. The board was set. The pieces were moving, and checkmate was just a few moves away. For the next 48 hours, I let them squirm in their own carefully constructed hell. David's messages became increasingly frantic as the full scope of his financial exile became clear. He had apparently tried to apply for a new line of credit and been systematically denied by every major bank. His credit score, once a source of considerable pride, had mysteriously plummeted overnight due to what the banks called irregular account activity and inconsistent income verification. He had also applied for a senior position at a rival sales company, a sure thing he'd been boasting about for weeks to anyone who would listen. It was a vice president role at Meridian Sales Solutions, a company that supposedly valued his experience and was eager to steal him away from Northwestern Chemical. He was summarily rejected without even being granted an interview. What David couldn't know, of course, was that Ethel Analytics had recently acquired a controlling interest in TransUnion Credit Solutions, one of the 3 major credit reporting agencies. A few lines of code, some algorithmic adjustments, and his financial profile had been flagged for enhanced scrutiny, a bureaucratic purgatory that would take months to resolve through official channels. He also couldn't know that Meridian Sales Solutions was actually a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that I had been quietly acquiring over the past year. The rejection hadn't come from the hiring manager who knew him personally. but from an automated screening system that had been programmed to flag his name for immediate disqualification. I had built a maze around him, a digital labyrinth of interconnected financial institutions and corporate entities, all designed to make him understand what it felt like to be powerless. He was beginning to realize he was the rat, but he had no idea how vast and sophisticated the maze actually was. My parents, meanwhile, were in full-blown panic mode. They had called everyone they knew, complaining about their new slumlord and getting nowhere. The other tenants in the building were facing the same crisis, creating a sense of collective helplessness that made individual actions seem futile. They had contacted tenant rights organizations, only to be told that the rent increase was completely legal. They had reached out to local news stations, but discovered that similar stories were happening across the city every week. Their personal catastrophe was just another footnote in Seattle's housing crisis. They left me a dozen voicemails, each one more accusatory than the last, demanding to know what I was doing to help them. The tone progressed from desperate pleading to angry demands to barely concealed blame. In their minds, I was failing them again, proving once more that I was the disappointment they had always known me to be. I ignored them all. Instead, I focused on the crown jewel of my revenge, the Veridian Corp acquisition. Anthony was operating like a master conductor, leading a symphony of financial destruction. He had assembled a team of the most ruthless corporate raiders in the business, former Goldman Sachs executives who had been quietly blacklisted for their aggressive tactics, Harvard MBAs who specialized in hostile takeovers, and algorithmic trading experts who could manipulate stock prices with surgical precision. The attack on Veridian was multi-pronged and devastating. First, we had identified and quietly purchased the company's outstanding debt from 3 different banks, giving us leverage over their credit facilities. Then, we had initiated a series of short sales designed to drive down their stock price, while simultaneously spreading carefully crafted rumors about their financial stability through industry-backed channels. But the masterstroke was the proxy battle. Through a network of shell corporations and nominee shareholders, we had been quietly acquiring Veridian stock for months, building a position large enough to challenge the current board of directors. The beauty was that no single entity owned enough shares to trigger disclosure requirements. We were operating through dozens of different fronts, each one appearing to be an independent investor. The board at Veridian was in chaos. They were fighting a ghost, an unseen corporate raider who seemed to know their every weakness and exploit every vulnerability. Emergency meetings were being called daily, consultants were being hired at enormous expense, and the stock price continued its relentless decline. They had no idea the attack was being orchestrated from a computer in a hidden mansion by the marketing analyst they had so casually discarded. The climax was scheduled for Friday. A mandatory emergency board meeting at Veridian Tower, where the directors would attempt to mount a defense against the mysterious takeover attempt. And I had just arranged a little meeting of my own. Thursday evening, I composed 3 separate emails, each one carefully crafted to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of its recipient. The first went to David. It came from a fictitious law firm called Wright and Campbell Associates, complete with a professional letterhead and a Seattle address that would check out if anyone bothered to verify it. The message was formal and intimidating, informing him that his estranged wife, Jennifer Smith, had retained legal counsel and was requesting a preliminary settlement meeting regarding their divorce. The email stated that Mrs. Smith had recently come into possession of certain financial assets that might affect the division of marital property, and that his attendance at a neutral location was required to discuss these developments. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at a private conference facility owned by a discreet estate planning firm. The mention of assets was carefully calculated bait. David would assume I had discovered some small inheritance or life insurance policy that I was trying to hide from him. His greed and his desperation would make him show up, expecting to claim half of whatever modest windfall I might have stumbled upon. The second email went to my parents. It came from Cascade Holdings, the property management company that now owned their building. The message was more sympathetic in tone, acknowledging the difficult situation that longtime tenants were facing due to the necessary rent adjustments. However, the email continued. The owner of the building had been made aware of their particular circumstances, their advanced age, their decades of responsible tenancy, and their connection to the beloved former owner, Sal Marconi. As a gesture of goodwill and respect for the building's history, the owner was willing to meet with them personally to discuss a possible accommodation or alternative arrangement. It was presented as a rare opportunity, a chance to appeal directly to the human being behind the corporate facade. They would see it as their last, best hope for avoiding financial ruin, a final chance to make their case to someone who might have the power to show mercy. The final email was the most delicate. It went to Edward Clark, my former boss and current interim CEO of Veridian Corp., who was drowning in the chaos of the hostile takeover attempt. The message came from the primary shell corporation that had been leading the acquisition, a company called Blackstone Meridian Holdings that existed only on paper and in bank accounts. The email was brief and ominous. It stated simply that the principals behind the takeover attempt had decided to arrange a face-to-face meeting to discuss terms for a potential resolution. The tone suggested that this was not a negotiation, but rather an opportunity for Mr. Clark to hear the terms of his surrender. For a man who was watching his company being systematically destroyed by an enemy he couldn't identify, the email would represent either salvation or doom. But either way, he would have to attend. All 3 emails listed the same time and the same address. The address of my estate in the mountains, disguised as a private conference facility called Summit Executive Retreat Center. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with that particular quality of mountain air that seemed to sharpen everything, colors, sounds, thoughts. I stood on the main deck of my house, looking down at the valley where Seattle sprawled in the distance, and felt a sense of profound calm settling over me. Today would be the end of one story and the beginning of another. I had spent the morning making final preparations. The conference room had been arranged with theatrical precision, a single long table with 4 chairs positioned to create maximum psychological impact. The wall behind my seat was a single pane of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a commanding view of the valley below, ensuring that I would be silhouetted against the light like a figure of judgment. My staff had been briefed and positioned. Stephanie White, my assistant, would greet each guest and manage their arrival to ensure maximum dramatic effect. Marcus Rodriguez, a different man than the security guard at Veridian, but with the same surname, which would add another layer of psychological dissonance for Edward Clark, would handle security and ensure that no one left before the meeting was concluded. The catering was minimal but precise: crystal glasses, imported water, nothing that would suggest comfort or hospitality. This was not a social gathering, it was a tribunal. At 2:15 p.m., the first security alert chimed on my phone. A rental car had approached the gates, a compact sedan that screamed financial desperation. The driver was David, and from the security camera footage, he looked haggard and stressed. He had clearly been sleeping poorly, and his usually immaculate appearance was showing signs of strain. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and there was a nervous energy in his movements that suggested a man operating on adrenaline and panic. He stared at the imposing gates for a full minute before pressing the call button. When Marcus's voice crackled through the intercom asking for his name, David's response was hesitant and confused. "I'm here for the meeting. Wright and Campbell Associates. I'm David Jones." The gates swung open silently, and he drove through with the cautious movements of someone who suspected he was making a terrible mistake but couldn't afford not to take the risk. 15 minutes later, a taxi arrived. My parents emerged slowly, my mother clutching her purse like a shield, while my father looked around with the suspicious air of a man who had spent his entire life distrusting anything that seemed too good to be true. They were both dressed in their best clothes, outfits I recognized from church services and special occasions, and their nervousness was palpable even through the security monitors. The taxi driver had to help my father navigate the steep steps up to the front entrance, and I felt a fleeting moment of something that might have been guilt. They were old, they were frightened, and they were about to discover that their own daughter was the architect of their destruction. But the moment passed. They had made their choices just as I had made mine. At exactly 3:00 p.m., the final guest arrived. Edward Clark's black limousine looked absurdly out of place against the natural beauty of the mountain setting. He emerged looking like a man walking to his own execution, pale, drawn, and clutching his briefcase with white-knuckled desperation. He stood for a moment outside the car, looking up at the house with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind, trying to reconcile the modest marketing analyst he had fired with the obvious wealth and power represented by this estate. All three of them were escorted to the conference room by different routes, ensuring that they had no opportunity to speak to each other before the main event. I wanted their shock to be pure, their confusion complete. I took my position at the head of the table and waited. They entered the room in carefully orchestrated sequence, each one more confused than the last. It was a perfectly legal, completely ruthless business decision that happened in Seattle's real estate market dozens of times each year. Older buildings got bought out, rents got raised to market rates, and longtime residents got displaced by the economics of urban development. To my parents, it would be a financial catastrophe that would force them to choose between poverty and homelessness. The beauty of the strategy was its simplicity. I wasn't targeting them specifically. I was treating them exactly like any other tenant in a property I had legitimately acquired. They would have no grounds for complaint, no legal recourse, no one to blame except the anonymous forces of market capitalism. The email notification pinged on my computer at 3:47 p.m. The certified letters had been delivered. All 37 tenants had received their notices simultaneously, creating a building-wide crisis that would mask any personal vendetta. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it. It didn't take long. The phone rang at 5:23 p.m. I was in my study, reviewing the preliminary reports on the Viridian acquisition. Anthony's team had been working around the clock, and the initial phase was proceeding ahead of schedule. Viridian's board was completely unaware that they were under attack. They thought their recent stock volatility was just market turbulence in the wake of losing the Apex account. The caller ID showed Mom, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But I was curious to hear the panic in her voice, to witness the moment when her comfortable certainty about the world began to crumble. "Jennifer, you won't believe what's happened," she began before I could even say hello. Her voice was hysterical, higher pitched than I had ever heard it, with the breathless quality of someone who had just received devastating news. "This new company, some soulless corporation, they bought our building. They're tripling our rent, tripling it. Your father is having chest pains." I let her vent, listening to the panic and indignation pour through the phone like water through a broken dam. She painted a picture of two elderly, innocent victims being preyed upon by a faceless corporate monster, never imagining that the monster had a very familiar face. "That's terrible, Mom," I said, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. "How could they do something like that? They're calling it market rate adjustments and capital improvement necessities," she said, reading directly from the letter. "They want $4,000 a month, $4,000. We've been paying $1,200 for 20 years. It's highway robbery." I could hear my father in the background, his voice more agitated than I had heard since my grandfather's funeral. 38 years I worked for the Postal Service," he was saying. 38 years, this is what we get. This is our reward for being responsible, for saving our money, for playing by the rules. "It's corporate greed, pure and simple," my mother continued. "These investment companies, they buy up affordable housing and price out seniors who built this community. It's predatory. It should be illegal." The irony was exquisite. For 35 years, they had lectured me about the virtues of capitalism, about how success was a matter of hard work and smart decisions. They had praised David's business sense and dismissed my marketing career as frivolous. Now they were discovering that the free market they had always championed didn't care about their feelings or their history or their need for affordable housing. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We don't know," she said, and for the first time in my memory, my mother sounded genuinely frightened. "The letter says we have 60 days to decide, pay the new rent or move out. But where can we go? Rent is crazy expensive everywhere now, and your father's health, moving at our age." She trailed off, the full scope of their crisis finally settling in. They weren't just facing a rent increase. They were facing the destruction of their carefully planned retirement, the end of their financial security, and the very real possibility of homelessness in their 70s. "You have to do something," she said suddenly, her fear transforming into desperate demand. "You have to call a lawyer for us. David always helped us with these things, but now, you have to help us fight this." And there it was. Even now, after calling me their greatest disappointment, after hanging up on me in disgust just 24 hours earlier, they believed it was my duty to solve their problems. They saw me as a tool, a resource to be deployed when needed, someone whose value was measured entirely by my usefulness to them. "I don't know, Mom," I said, planting the seed of doubt. "I just lost my job, remember? I don't have money for lawyers, and David is gone. I have nothing, just like you said." "Be so selfish." She snapped, her fear turning to anger with remarkable speed. "This is your family. We raised you, we sacrificed for you, and now we need help. What are we supposed to do? Become homeless?" The raw desperation in her voice was music to me. This was the consequence of a lifetime of their conditional love, their constant judgment, their willingness to abandon me the moment I failed to meet their expectations. They thought they had broken me with their disappointment. They were about to find out they had actually armed me. "Me see what I can find out," I said softly, injecting just enough hope into my voice to keep them hanging on. "I'll make some calls." I hung up and returned to my monitors, watching the global markets shift and flow like digital rivers of opportunity. The board was set. The pieces were moving, and checkmate was just a few moves away. For the next 48 hours, I let them squirm in their own carefully constructed hell. David's messages became increasingly frantic as the full scope of his financial exile became clear. He had apparently tried to apply for a new line of credit and been systematically denied by every major bank. His credit score, once a source of considerable pride, had mysteriously plummeted overnight due to what the banks called irregular account activity and inconsistent income verification. He had also applied for a senior position at a rival sales company, a sure thing he'd been boasting about for weeks to anyone who would listen. It was a vice president role at Meridian Sales Solutions, a company that supposedly valued his experience and was eager to steal him away from Northwestern Chemical. He was summarily rejected without even being granted an interview. What David couldn't know, of course, was that Ethel Analytics had recently acquired a controlling interest in TransUnion Credit Solutions, one of the 3 major credit reporting agencies. A few lines of code, some algorithmic adjustments, and his financial profile had been flagged for enhanced scrutiny, a bureaucratic purgatory that would take months to resolve through official channels. He also couldn't know that Meridian Sales Solutions was actually a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that I had been quietly acquiring over the past year. The rejection hadn't come from the hiring manager who knew him personally, but from an automated screening system that had been programmed to flag his name for immediate disqualification. I had built a maze around him, a digital labyrinth of interconnected financial institutions and corporate entities, all designed to make him understand what it felt like to be powerless.